Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. In the early winter of 1851, as the crisp air settled over the jagged ridges of the Sierra Nevada, prospectors in the mining camp of Whiskey Flats, California, gathered around their fires, swapping tales of fortune and failure. Among them sat Thomas Whitaker, a quiet man of 43, who kept to himself and carried what the others mockingly called his rusty contraption, a modified gold pan unlike any other in the camp. While standard pans were smooth and polished, Whitaker's was etched with concentric ridges and treated with a peculiar iron oxide mixture that gave it a deep rust-brown color. The other miners laughed openly at his backwards ways, convinced his odd methods would yield nothing but wasted hours. The Whiskey Flat settlement had sprung up like dozens of others along the American River tributaries following the 1848 discovery at Sutter's Mill. By 1851, the easy gold was long gone, and men fought over diminishing returns from increasingly difficult terrain. Geological survey notes from the period, later recovered from the Sacramento Records Office in 1962, indicate that Whiskey Flats sat at the confluence of three watersheds, a promising location on paper, but one that had proven frustratingly inconsistent for most who worked it. The hills surrounding the camp showed the scars of hasty excavation, abandoned shafts, collapsed trenches, and the skeletal remains of sluice boxes discarded when their locations proved unproductive. The river itself, a tributary of the South Yuba, known locally as Grizzly Creek, wound through a narrow valley flanked by steep slopes of weathered granite and dense pine forest. During the spring melt, it roared with brown, silt-laden water, but by late autumn, it had dwindled to a clear, cold stream that revealed the rounded stones of its bed. This seasonal transformation was crucial to understanding the river's secrets, though few miners had the patience to study its cycles. In the weeks preceding Whitaker's demonstration, several prospectors had abandoned Whiskey Flats entirely, heading downriver toward Sacramento or south to try their luck in the Mariposa district, where rumors of new strikes circulated. Those who remained were the stubborn, the desperate, and the few who had built structures substantial enough that abandonment represented too great a loss of investment. The mood in camp had grown increasingly somber as winter tightened its grip and daily returns diminished. According to meteorological records from Sacramento, the winter of 1851-52 began earlier and proved harsher than usual for the region. November brought the first significant snowfall to the Sierra foothills, with temperatures dropping sharply by mid-month. For the miners of Whiskey Flats, working in icy water became a painful necessity, with many suffering the early stages of frostbite on fingers and toes. The cost of provisions rose accordingly, as supply wagons found the mountain trails increasingly difficult to navigate. Daily life in the camp followed predictable rhythms, dawn to dusk, panning in the cold water, evenings spent drying out by campfires, Sundays reserved for trading, letter writing, and what passed for socializing in those rough conditions. Most miners adhered strictly to techniques that had become standard: smooth brass or iron pans, specific swirling motions, and conventional locations along the riverbanks. Innovation was rare and often discouraged. In an environment where a day's lost work might mean a day without food, experimentation seemed foolish extravagance. The physical layout of Whiskey Flats reflected the hurried, utilitarian mindset of its inhabitants. Approximately 40 crude structures lined both sides of a muddy track that served as the camp's main street. The buildings, a combination of rough-hewn log cabins, canvas tents reinforced with whatever timber could be salvaged, and a few more substantial structures, clustered around the essential services: a general supply store, a crude assayer's office, and the inevitably named Eureka Saloon that doubled as the camp's social center and de facto administrative headquarters. The store, operated by a former prospector named Silas Morgan, who had wisely recognized that selling to miners was more reliable than mining itself, maintained meticulous account books that later proved invaluable to historians documenting the camp's economic patterns. The winter of 1851-52 was already showing signs of hardship by November, with Morgan's ledgers recording declining purchases and increasing credit extensions. Many accounts now 2 months in arrears, he noted in the margin of his November 28th entries, must consider limiting further advances until spring prospects improve. Adjacent to Morgan's establishment stood the assayer's office, a simple structure where miners could have their findings evaluated and exchanged for currency or credit at the store. The assayer, a former bank clerk from St. Louis named Edwin Hargrove, maintained his own records of daily yields throughout the camp. These records, partially preserved in the California State Archives, show a clear downward trend in overall production from September through December 1851, with increasingly frequent days when no new gold was presented for assessment. The Eureka Saloon, the largest structure in Whiskey Flats, consisted of a main room dominated by a rough-hewn bar, several tables for card games, and a small area cleared for occasional musical performances or impromptu dances when traveling entertainers passed through. Its proprietor, Francis McAllister, a former Texas Ranger with a fearsome reputation and the camp's only firearm, served as the closest thing to law enforcement Whiskey Flats possessed. His establishment provided not just whiskey and occasional entertainment, but also functioned as the camp's post office, meeting hall, and arbitration venue for disputes too significant to be settled privately. Thomas Whitaker's presence was an anomaly in several regards. Census records from Virginia indicate a Thomas Whitaker, wheelwright and blacksmith, had departed Richmond in 1848, though unlike most gold seekers, he had traveled alone and seemingly without haste. He arrived at Whiskey Flats nearly a year after its establishment, having spent time at 3 other camps according to fragmentary registries. In each location, notes indicated he stayed just long enough to observe, work modestly, and move on, never striking it rich, but never completely empty-handed either. Unlike most who arrived at the goldfields, Whitaker brought with him specialized tools of his own making, not just the modified pan that would later prove so valuable, but a collection of custom implements for testing soil composition, measuring water flow, and evaluating sediment distribution. These tools, described in several contemporary accounts, suggested preparation and forethought unusual among prospectors, most of whom arrived with minimal equipment and acquired whatever they needed locally, often at inflated prices. The substantial collection of notebooks he maintained, only fragmentary portions of which survived to be studied by later historians, contained detailed observations not just of mining conditions but of weather patterns, seasonal changes in vegetation, variations in water clarity, and even the behavior of wildlife in relation to the river system. One recovered page contained meticulous sketches of the tracks left by different animals in riverside mud, with notes suggesting that certain species instinctively gravitated toward locations where underground water sources emerged, locations that Whitaker apparently recognized as potentially promising for gold deposits. Whitaker's appearance set him apart as well. While most miners wore whatever hodgepodge of clothing circumstances permitted, often tattered, perpetually damp, and caked with mud, Whitaker maintained an almost fastidious neatness that struck some as pretentious. His clothing was plain but serviceable, typically clean despite the muddy conditions, and he wore a distinctive broad-brimmed hat that he had apparently waterproofed with some kind of oil treatment. Morgan's store ledgers show that unlike the sporadic, impulse-driven purchases of many miners, Whitaker bought supplies with methodical regularity, smaller amounts, but at consistent intervals, suggesting careful planning rather than the boom-and-bust pattern typical of the camp. Most distinctive was his living quarters. while other miners crowded into shared cabins or tents to pool resources and labor. Whitaker constructed a small but surprisingly sturdy shelter on the outskirts of the camp. Documentary evidence from multiple sources describes it as unusually well designed for the conditions. Elevated slightly on foundation stones to prevent flooding, walls chinked with a mixture of clay and pine needles for insulation, and a small but efficient stone hearth that reportedly used significantly less firewood than the open fires or crude stoves of his neighbors. A letter from a visiting mining company representative, dated November 1851 and preserved in corporate archives in San Francisco, mentioned Whitaker's cabin specifically. Among the crude dwellings typical of these temporary settlements, one structure stands out for its thoughtful construction. Built by a Virginia blacksmith, it incorporates several ingenious features adapted specifically to local conditions, including adjustable ventilation, a heat-reflective interior surface of hammered tin, and a roofline designed to shed snow away from the entrance path. These refinements, while requiring additional initial effort, clearly provide superior protection against the increasingly harsh weather conditions. This attention to site-specific adaptation extended to all aspects of Whitaker's approach to the gold fields. Where most prospectors arrived with fixed notions of how gold should be found and extracted, typically based on second-hand accounts of successful techniques used elsewhere, Whitaker appeared to treat each location as a unique problem requiring fresh analysis. His notebooks contained separate sections for each camp he visited, with observations of the particular geological and hydrological conditions present, and notes on how standard techniques might need modification to suit these specific circumstances. Whitaker keeps to himself, works shorter hours than most, yet never seems desperate for provisions, wrote David Hammond, a camp record keeper who maintained a personal journal recovered during a 1959 excavation of the old camp site. Some suspect he has a secret claim elsewhere, others that he's merely careful with his meager findings. All agree his methods are peculiar and inefficient. Hammond, a former school teacher from Massachusetts who had come west hoping to fund the establishment of a school through mining success, maintained one of the most comprehensive contemporary accounts of life at Whiskey Flats. His journal, recovered largely intact, provided historians with invaluable insights into the social dynamics of the camp, including detailed observations of how Whitaker's unconventional methods were received by the community. The men mock his endless measuring and note-taking, Hammond wrote in October 1851. While they rush each morning to work familiar locations, Whitaker often spends the first hour simply observing the river, recording water levels, and testing sediment from different locations before selecting where to begin his day's work. They call it laziness or affectation. He seems to consider it essential preparation. The ridicule Whitaker endured was documented in multiple accounts. A letter from prospector James Everett to his brother in Boston, dated February 1851, mentioned a curious fellow with a rust-eaten pan who spends more time studying the river than working it. The men have sport at his expense, but he seems untroubled by their jests. The pan itself, described consistently across several sources, featured hand-tooled concentric grooves that ran counter to conventional wisdom about gold panning surfaces. The prevailing theory among successful miners was that a pan's interior should be as smooth as possible, allowing gold particles to slide easily across the surface while lighter materials washed away. Some even polished their pans with grease or oil to enhance this quality. Whitaker's approach, creating deliberate texture that would seemingly impede the separation process, appeared counterintuitive to the point of absurdity. The rusty coloration, which most miners fought against with regular scouring, only added to the impression that Whitaker either didn't understand basic prospecting principles or was deliberately flouting them out of some misplaced contrarianism. The technical specifications of Whitaker's pan, as reconstructed by later researchers from contemporary descriptions, and the surviving artifact discovered in 1887 reveal a design of surprising sophistication. The grooves were not randomly placed, but followed a precise pattern that created miniature eddies when water moved across the surface in specific motions. The rust treatment, far from being neglect, was deliberately cultivated to create a microscopically rough surface at the metal level, increasing friction against the smallest gold particles. Metallurgical analysis conducted by the University of California in 1960 confirmed that the iron oxide layer had been deliberately treated with some form of mild acid to enhance its textural properties. This technique, not formally documented in mining literature until the 1870s, demonstrated Whittaker's experimental approach and willingness to challenge conventional practices based on observed results rather than established theory. But what the miners of Whiskey Flats could not see was the method behind Whittaker's apparent madness. While they focused exclusively on the gravel bars where gold had been found before, Whittaker spent hours studying water flow patterns, sediment distribution, and the unique geological formations of the area. His notebooks, partially preserved in the Yuba County Historical Society archives, accessioned in 1967, revealed painstaking observations of seasonal changes in water levels, current speeds, and sediment compositions at different points along the river system. These notebooks, written in a precise, educated hand that belied the frontier setting, contained detailed sketches of river cross-sections, calculations of water volume and velocity, and even crude maps tracking the movement of sediment during different flow conditions. One particularly revealing page, dated October 12, 1851, contained a series of small diagrams showing how gold particles of different sizes behaved in water currents of varying speeds. Next to these, Whittaker had sketched several alternative pan designs with notes on how each might affect the retention of different-sized particles. Another notebook entry, dated November 5, 1851, detailed observations of how rainfall upstream affected sediment distribution days later at Whiskey Flats. Heavy precipitation in the higher elevations on October 30th has resulted in increased turbidity and altered flow patterns today. Previous deposition sites now showing significant erosion, while new gravel bars forming approximately 400 yards downstream from former locations. Conventional panning sites abandoned by others, now possibly renewed with fresh material. Particularly interesting to later mining engineers who studied these documents was Whittaker's apparent understanding of fluid dynamics principles that wouldn't be formally applied to mining operations for another 30 years. His notes referenced boundary layer effects and flow separation zones, concepts he had clearly developed through careful observation rather than formal education. One notation read, "Gold does not move uniformly with water. Smallest particles develop different relationships to flow than larger ones. Standard panning motion works against these differences rather than exploiting them." This insight, while that different-sized particles interact differently with moving water, seems obvious in retrospect, but represented a significant conceptual advancement at the time. Most miners treated gold simply as a heavier material that would naturally separate from lighter sand and soil through gravitational sorting when agitated in water. Whittaker's recognition that particle size created more complex relationships with water flow, and that these relationships could be exploited through specific techniques and equipment modifications, anticipated developments in hydraulic engineering that would later revolutionize industrial mining operations. The winter of 1851-1852 proved particularly harsh in the Sierra foothills. Early December brought freezing temperatures that made conventional panning nearly impossible. Ice formed along the edges of streams, and fingers numbed too quickly for the delicate work of separating gold from sand. Camp records show that by December 18th, nearly a third of Whiskey Flats' population had either departed for Sacramento or huddled in makeshift shelters, surviving on dwindling provisions and abandoned hopes. Morgan's store ledgers from this period show a precipitous decline in transactions, with many days recording no sales at all. A December 22nd entry noted, "No new stock received since November 29th. Road to Sacramento reportedly impassable due to snow in the passes. Remaining inventory limited to basic staples and a few luxury items no one can afford. Extended additional credit to 7 accounts today against better judgment." A particularly telling entry from December 24th indicated the deteriorating conditions. Christmas Eve. Sold last candles to Hammond for letter writing. No flour, coffee in low supply, salt pork sufficient for perhaps another week at current population. 3 men departed this morning for Sacramento despite weather, carrying reports of our condition. Unless supply wagon arrives within 10 days, must consider organizing larger exodus before passes become completely impassable. No mail for 18 days, no new supplies. The cold deepens and spirits fall accordingly, wrote Hammond on December 21st. Even the most stubborn have ceased working the river. We subsist on what little remains and wait for a break in the weather. Hammond's journal entries from this period provide a vivid portrait of a community in crisis. On December 25th, he wrote, "Christmas Day passes without celebration. McAllister distributed small rations of whiskey from his dwindling supply, a gesture met with momentary appreciation that quickly faded as men returned to cold shelters and empty prospects. Williams and Carpenter engaged in physical altercation over alleged theft of firewood, separated by others before serious harm, but incident indicative of deteriorating social bonds under pressure of continued privation. The physical hardships were compounded by psychological strain. The miners of Whiskey Flats, like most who had come to California seeking quick fortune, were generally ill-prepared for extended isolation or deprivation. Many had left families and communities where basic necessities were taken for granted, and the reality of frontier vulnerability was a harsh awakening. Hammond's journal entries from late December described increasing tensions, occasional physical altercations over trivial matters, and a pervasive melancholy that settled over the camp like the winter snow. Men who arrived as optimistic adventurers now sit hollow-eyed by inadequate fires, speaking little and hoping only for survival until conditions improve, he wrote on December 30th. The daily discussion has shifted from techniques for finding gold to methods of preserving body heat, stretching provisions, and maintaining shelter against increasingly frequent storms. Several have fallen ill with fever or persistent coughs, but no medical supplies remain beyond crude willow bark tea and whatever alcohol McAllister still possesses. It was during this period of enforced idleness that attention increasingly turned to Whitaker, who continued his daily routine despite the conditions. Each morning he would disappear downstream for several hours, returning with small but consistent amounts of gold dust, never a fortune, but more than anyone else was finding in those frozen weeks. The derision gradually shifted to curiosity, then to suspicion. What particularly galled the other miners was Whitaker's apparent comfort compared to their increasing desperation. While they huddled around inadequate fires in drafty shelters, Whitaker's small cabin remained notably warm with minimal fuel. While they stretched dwindling provisions, he seemed to maintain a steady if modest diet. And most infuriatingly, while their gold pouches remained empty, his continued to fill gradually day after day. Several journal entries and letters from this period note that Whitaker made no attempt to conceal his continued success, modest though it was. He regularly visited Morgan's store to exchange small quantities of gold dust for provisions, and occasionally even extended credit to others who were particularly desperate. This generosity, rather than alleviating suspicion, somehow intensified it. As one miner reportedly commented, "A man doesn't share what he works hard for unless he knows there's plenty more where it came from." The contrast between Whitaker's measured success and the community's collective failure created a dangerous psychological dynamic. As Hammond observed on January 1, 1852, "New Year brings no renewed hope, only deeper resentment toward our solitary prospector. His continued finding of gold, when all others fail, transgresses the unspoken rule of shared fate that binds men in such circumstances. Better all should fail together than one succeed while others suffer. Such is the perverse arithmetic of desperate men. Social dynamics in isolated frontier communities could turn dangerous quickly, and Whiskey Flats was no exception. Success amid others' failure, particularly when the methods behind that success were not shared or understood, frequently led to accusations of theft, deception, or worse. In mining camps where no formal legal system existed, such accusations could escalate from suspicious whispers to vigilante action with alarming speed. Accusations fly regarding Whitaker's persistent success, Hammond's Journal continued on January 3, 1852. Some claim he must have a hidden cache he merely pretends to discover daily. Others suggest more nefarious means. The mood in camp grows dangerous with idleness and want. The situation came to a head in mid-January when three of the camp's more aggressive residents, Samuel Cross, Peter Donnelly, and William Rice, confronted Whitaker as he returned from his day's work. According to witness accounts compiled later by a territorial marshal, the three men demanded Whitaker reveal his secret claim or hidden supply. When he calmly offered instead to show them his working method the following day, they became incensed, convinced he was stalling or deceiving them. Cross, described in multiple sources as a former Missouri riverboat gambler with a volatile temperament, was the apparent leader of the confrontation. Hammond's Journal characterized him as quick to anger and quicker to suspect others of deception, having himself practiced it extensively. Donnelly and Rice, about whom less is documented, appear to have been typical of the desperate prospectors who populated the camps, men who had risked everything on the promise of gold and found themselves instead facing destitution and possible starvation as winter deepened. Court records from St. Louis, discovered by researchers in 1963, suggest that Cross had fled Missouri to escape gambling debts and possibly criminal charges related to a card game altercation that resulted in serious injury to another player. This background may explain his readiness to resort to violence when confronted with what he perceived as another form of cheating, Whitaker's secretive success amid general failure. What followed was recorded in multiple sources, including the aforementioned Marshall's report and Hammond's Journal. The three men attempted to seize Whitaker's panning equipment and the day's findings. In the ensuing struggle, Whitaker suffered a broken arm and facial lacerations, while his precious notebooks were thrown into a fire. The rusted pan itself was taken by Cross, who proclaimed he would put the secret to proper use. The attack occurred in full view of several other miners who, while not intervening, later provided consistent accounts of the incident. Particularly noted was Whitaker's composure throughout. He apparently offered no resistance beyond attempting to protect his notebooks, made no counter-accusations, and spoke only to suggest that the men would not benefit from his equipment without understanding the principles behind its design. Hammond's Journal entry for January 14th described the immediate aftermath. Whitaker returned to his cabin, assisted by Miller, who provided basic medical attention to his injuries. Most disturbing was his demeanor, not anger or fear, but a profound disappointment, as though he had expected better of men driven to such extremity. When asked if he wished McAllister to intervene, he declined, stating simply that the pan will prove its own case when properly understood or fail in ignorant hands, and either outcome will resolve the matter more effectively than confrontation. Even more remarkable was his response after the assault. Rather than retreating to tend his injuries, Whitaker approached Morgan at the store and requested paper and pencils to replace his destroyed notes. Morgan, according to his ledger entry for January 14th, initially refused credit for these non-essential items, but relented when Whitaker produced a small pouch of gold dust sufficient to cover not only his purchase, but several outstanding debts from other miners. This unexpected display of resources further inflamed suspicions about secret claims or hoarded findings. A notation in Morgan's personal journal, distinct from his business ledgers and discovered among family papers donated to the Nevada County Historical Society in 1958, provided additional context, provided T. Whitaker with requested items today despite initial reluctance. His ability to produce payment when most accounts stand empty raises obvious questions, yet his explanation for continuing to work despite injury, that principles must be tested under varying conditions to be proven valid, suggests a mind more concerned with verification than immediate gain. Still, his methods remain peculiar, and the camp's suspicions, while potentially dangerous, are not without foundation. The next morning, the three men set out with Whitaker's pan, following his usual path downstream. They returned that evening empty-handed and increasingly convinced Whitaker had been salting his pan with pre-acquired gold. The camp's informal justice system, basically the consensus of the strongest personalities, determined that Whitaker would be given one chance to demonstrate his method or face expulsion from the camp, a potentially deadly sentence in the winter conditions. The concept of frontier justice in mining camps of this era operated on principles quite distinct from formal legal systems. Without courts, jails, or official authority figures, communities developed ad hoc mechanisms for resolving disputes and addressing perceived threats. These mechanisms typically combined elements of direct democracy, issues decided by majority vote among all adult males, respect for demonstrated strength or success, and a pragmatic focus on maintaining sufficient order for the community to function rather than abstract notions of justice or individual rights. In the case of Whiskey Flats, Hammond's journal and other accounts describe a typical arrangement. Serious matters were discussed and decided at impromptu meetings held in the Eureka Saloon, with the owner, a former Texas Ranger named McAllister, serving as de facto moderator. Decisions were reached by consensus where possible, or simple majority vote when necessary. Enforcement relied on collective action. There was no dedicated constable or sheriff. McAllister's own fragmentary records, preserved in the Texas Ranger Historical Archives and examined by researchers in 1970, include brief mentions of his time at Whiskey Flats. A letter to a former colleague in February 1852 noted, "Have found myself appointed judge and jury without seeking the position, simply by virtue of possessing the only firearm in 50 miles, and a reputation from our ranger days that preceded my arrival. The men look to me for decisions I am ill-equipped to make, having no law books nor legal training, but necessity demands some order be maintained, and better my rough justice than none at all." The meeting regarding Whitaker's case occurred on the evening of January 16, 1852. Hammond recorded that approximately 30 men, nearly the entire remaining adult male population of the camp, crowded into the saloon. Cross presented his accusations that Whitaker was secretly mining a rich claim while pretending to use his unusual methods in unproductive areas, that he refused to share knowledge that could benefit the community, and that his secretive nature suggested dishonesty or even criminality. Whitaker, his arm splinted and face still showing the marks of the previous day's assault, offered a simple defense. He had no secret claim, only a different approach based on careful study of the river's patterns. He proposed to demonstrate his method the following day to anyone who wished to observe. After considerable debate, the Assembly voted narrowly to accept this proposal, with the understanding that if the demonstration failed to produce results, Whitaker would be required to leave Whiskey Flats immediately. Hammond's account of the meeting provides insight into how precarious Whitaker's position was. The vote stood 18 in favor of allowing the demonstration, 12 opposed. Among those opposed, several argued forcefully for immediate expulsion, claiming the camp could not spare resources for those who kept secrets in times of communal hardship. Cross insisted that the demonstration would prove worthless, as Whitaker would simply lead them to his hidden cache. Only McAllister's intervention reminding the Assembly that judgments made in haste with incomplete information have proved regrettable, in my experience, prevented immediate action. Even so, the conditions set were harsh. Failure to produce significant findings using his method in a location of the Assembly's choosing rather than his own would result in immediate expulsion with only what he could carry on his injured person. Despite his injuries, Whitaker agreed to the demonstration. On January 17, 1852, a group of 12 miners, including Hammond, who documented the events, accompanied the injured Whitaker to a location nearly 2 miles downstream from the main camp. What they witnessed that day would eventually transform mining practices throughout the western Sierra foothills. The morning of the demonstration broke clear and cold, with temperatures well below freezing. Hammond recorded that the party departed shortly after sunrise, following Whitaker along a path that paralleled Grizzly Creek downstream. The difficult terrain and Whitaker's injuries made progress slow. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the designated location. Several members of the party, including Cross, made pointed comments about the time being wasted on what they still considered a futile exercise or deliberate deception. The mood was hostile as we trudged through snow, drifted knee-deep in places, Hammond wrote. Every stumble by Whitaker was met with derisive comments suggesting he was deliberately delaying. Cross repeatedly suggested we had already passed suitable locations, implying that Whitaker was leading us away from areas where his pretend method would obviously fail. Only McAllister's stern presence prevented further aggression, though even he expressed growing impatience as the morning wore on. The location Whitaker had chosen displayed none of the usual indicators that experienced prospectors looked for. It was not a gravel bar, nor the inside bend of the river where gold typically concentrated. Instead, it was a seemingly unremarkable stretch where the river narrowed slightly between two weathered granite formations, creating a subtle acceleration in water flow. Whitaker directed us to clear snow from a flat rock overlooking the narrowing, Hammond wrote. From there, he pointed out features none had previously considered significant. The water's surface showed patterns, ripples, and small standing waves that indicated submerged structures affecting the flow. Most striking was his insistence that these patterns changed with the water level and temperature, requiring continuous reassessment. This concept, that the river was not a static entity but a dynamic system constantly reconfiguring its relationship with the gold it carried, ran counter to the prevailing approach among miners. The standard practice was to identify locations where gold had previously been found and work them intensively until they were exhausted. Whitaker instead proposed a model where optimal mining locations shifted constantly based on water conditions, requiring regular observation and adaptation rather than habitual repetition of established techniques. He asked us to observe how the water behaved differently at various points along this narrow section, Hammond continued. Where we saw only a uniform flow, he identified specific zones where the current created what he termed collection points, locations where the interaction of water speed, depth, and subsurface features caused heavier materials to deposit, while lighter materials continued downstream. These points, he explained, were not fixed but shifted with changing conditions, requiring the prospector to read the river anew each day, rather than rely on previous success. The skeptical audience grew restless during this theoretical explanation. Cross, in particular, repeatedly interrupted to demand practical demonstration rather than what he called fancy talk that butters no bread. Yet even the most impatient observers found themselves gradually drawn into Whitaker's methodical analysis of the river system as he identified specific features that, once pointed out, became obvious even to untrained eyes. After explaining these principles to the skeptical audience, Whitaker led them down to the water's edge at a specific point indicated by his observations. The spot itself appeared unremarkable, a slight recession in the bank, where the current seemed to slow momentarily before rejoining the main flow. Here, with his good arm, he began to demonstrate his distinctive panning technique. Using a replacement pan borrowed for the demonstration, Whitaker showed how the conventional panning locations upstream were indeed played out or inaccessible due to winter conditions. But the specific spot he had identified, with its unique flow characteristics, was continuously receiving new material, including gold, that was being channeled by the underwater topography into predictable collection points. Most remarkable was his method with the pan itself, continued Hammond. Where we all use a circular motion to separate gold from sand by weight alone, Whitaker employed a different technique altogether. His forward and back motion, combined with the ridged surface of his customized pan, created what he called flow traps that caught the smallest particles of gold that our methods would wash away. These finds, as he termed them, were individually insignificant but collectively substantial. The demonstration yielded undeniable results. In less than an hour, working with an unfamiliar pan and one usable arm, Whitaker extracted gold dust approximately equal to what most men might find in 3 days of conventional panning in favorable conditions. The assembled miners watched in stunned silence as he explained how the unique properties of his ridged pan created micro-eddies that trapped fine gold particles that would slip over the smooth surface of a standard pan. The rust is no accident either, Hammond recorded Whitaker explaining. The textured oxide surface creates additional friction that helps hold the finest gold particles while the lighter sand washes away. I discovered this by accident as an apprentice blacksmith, observing how different metal surfaces interacted with materials of varying weights and sizes. As the demonstration continued, Whitaker elaborated on his systematic approach to prospecting. He explained how he had mapped the entire creek bed for miles in either direction, identifying specific hydrological features that created natural concentration points for gold particles. These features were not the obvious ones that most miners targeted, such as large rocks or pronounced bends, but subtle variations in the stream bed that created complex flow patterns invisible to casual observation. He showed us how to read the water's surface, wrote Hammond, identifying barely perceptible patterns that revealed the underwater structures channeling the flow. Most astonishing was his insistence that these patterns shifted not just seasonally, but sometimes daily with changes in temperature, rainfall upstream, or even the gradual movement of streambed materials. Where we had seen only water, he saw a detailed map of invisible forces constantly rearranging the river's hidden treasures. The impact of the demonstration was immediate and profound. Hammond described the group's reaction. Cross, who had been the most vocal skeptic, fell into unusual silence as Whitaker produced one small golden fleck after another from what appeared to be ordinary sand. Others began to examine the river with new eyes, pointing out patterns similar to those Whitaker had identified. By demonstration's end, the mood had transformed entirely, from hostile suspicion to eager attention, with men clustering around Whitaker requesting clarification on specific aspects of his technique. The immediate aftermath of the demonstration transformed the social dynamics of Whiskey Flats. Hammond's journal and correspondence between miners show that Whitaker's techniques were rapidly, if somewhat clumsily, adopted by others in the camp. Cross, Donnelly, and Rice made a public apology of sorts, returning the original pan they had taken, though by then it had been damaged in their attempts to use it. Cross presented the damaged pan to Whitaker this evening in the saloon, Hammond recorded, on January 18th. A stiff-necked apology accompanied it, with much qualification about reasonable suspicions in hard times and similar self-justification. Whitaker accepted with characteristic grace, noting only that the pan could be repaired and that understanding its principles was more important than the object itself. He spent the next 2 hours answering questions about his methods, sketching diagrams on scraps of paper to illustrate concepts difficult to express in words alone. Men who had voted for his expulsion just 2 days prior now competed for his attention, eager to apply his techniques to their own claims. More significantly, the incident marked a shift in the camp's collective approach to survival during the harsh winter conditions. The demonstration had revealed not just a superior gold-finding technique, but a fundamentally different philosophy, one that valued patient observation, methodical preparation, and adaptation to specific conditions over adherence to generalized practices or rushed exploitation of resources. Morgan's store ledger from late January 1852 documents this transformation through changing purchase patterns. Multiple entries show miners acquiring materials to modify their panning equipment according to Whitaker's design. More tellingly, there was a marked increase in purchases of notebooks, pencils, and measuring tools, items previously considered non-essential but now recognized as valuable for the systematic observation Whitaker had demonstrated. One particularly significant entry from January 25th recorded group purchase by 7 miners, brass wire, tin sheets, and metal files for pan modification, 3 notebooks, 4 pencils, string and weights for depth measurement. J. Harmon paid in full with gold dust from yesterday's expedition using new method. First significant transaction in over 2 weeks without credit extension. Territorial records show that by February 1852, productivity at Whiskey Flats had increased substantially despite the continuing winter conditions. A supply merchant's ledger, preserved in the California State Mining Museum collection since 1964, shows a marked increase in orders for metalworking tools and materials as miners attempted to modify their own pans to mimic Whitaker's design. Morgan's store ledgers from late January through March 1852 document this transformation in concrete economic terms. Sales of materials for modifying panning equipment, files, small hammers, metal punches, and even iron oxide compounds increased dramatically. Entries also show the emergence of an impromptu apprenticeship system, with Whitaker receiving small payments or goods in exchange for demonstrating his techniques to individuals or small groups. Provided T. Whitaker, with 2 weeks' provisions in exchange for instruction in his methods, reads a February 8th entry for miner Michael Donovan. Similar arrangements appear throughout the ledger, suggesting that Whitaker had transitioned from ridiculed outsider to valued instructor. Morgan himself apparently recognized the shift, extending credit more readily to those who had studied with Whitaker, presumably judging that their improved prospects made them better credit risks. The impact extended beyond simple economic transactions. Hammond's journal entries from February 1852 describe how Whitaker's methods influenced broader aspects of camp organization. Groups of miners who had previously competed now collaborated, pooling observations of river conditions and sharing information about productive locations. This cooperation, unusual in the typically competitive atmosphere of mining camps, reflected a recognition that Whitaker's approach required more systematic observation than any individual could accomplish alone. Williams, Peterson, and the Carpenter brothers have formed what they call an observation consortium, Hammond wrote on February 12th. Each monitors different sections of the river daily, recording conditions in a shared notebook and meeting each evening to plan the following day's work based on collective findings. They report significantly improved yields compared to their previous individual efforts, though still less than what Whitaker consistently achieves. Most striking is the change in their temperament, the frantic, almost desperate quality of their former competition, replaced by methodical collaboration and shared satisfaction in gradual improvement. More significantly, Whitaker's methodical approach to prospecting, studying water flow patterns and riverbed structures rather than simply following where others had found gold, began to influence the broader strategy of the camp. Groups of miners now spent time observing and analyzing different stretches of the river system before committing to work in a particular location. Hammond's journal entries from February and March 1852 describe this evolution in detail. "The camp has become a school of sort," he wrote on February 20th. "Men who once rushed from site to site now spend hours studying the water, debating subtle differences in current patterns, and testing theories about sediment movement. Cross, who so recently threatened violence against our teacher, now fancies himself an expert on hydraulic dynamics, a term I doubt he knew a month ago. "We have become students of water," wrote prospector Alonzo Keegan in a letter home dated March 3, 1852. "Where once we simply dug and panned wherever others seemed successful, we now study the river like Whitaker taught us, noting how it changes with rainfall, how the current shapes the riverbed, and where the natural features might concentrate what we seek. It requires patience and observation, foreign to the rushed prospector, but the results cannot be argued with." This transformation extended beyond mining techniques to affect broader aspects of camp life. Hammond and other chroniclers noted that the emphasis on observation and adaptation gradually influenced how the miners approached other challenges of frontier existence. Cabins were modified with improved insulation techniques after studying how Whitaker's shelter maintained warmth with minimal fuel. Food preservation methods were refined based on systematic testing rather than tradition. Even social arrangements evolved, with the camp developing more formal systems for sharing information and resources. "The lesson of the pan has spread to other aspects of our existence," Hammond wrote on March 15th. "Men who once refused to deviate from familiar methods now experiment regularly with improvements to every aspect of camp life. It is as though Whitaker's demonstration unlocked a capacity for innovation previously suppressed by fear of failure or ridicule. We find ourselves approaching old problems with new perspectives, questioning assumptions that once seemed unassailable." A particularly notable example of this broader influence appeared in Morgan's store ledger for late March 1852. An entry recorded the formation of a community provisionment committee that coordinated bulk purchases from Sacramento suppliers, resulting in significantly lower prices and more reliable delivery schedules. The committee's organizational document, preserved as an attachment to Morgan's records, explicitly referenced the principle of systematic observation and data collection demonstrated by T. Whitaker's mining method as the inspiration for its approach to inventory management and needs forecasting. As spring arrived and conditions improved, news of the Whiskey Flats techniques spread to neighboring camps. Territorial records and newspaper accounts from Sacramento and San Francisco mention the Whitaker method, or flat system, being adopted along various tributaries of the American and Yuba rivers. By summer 1852, modified pans with ridge surfaces were being manufactured in Sacramento and sold at premium prices to prospectors throughout the region. The Sacramento Daily Union, in an article dated July 17, 1852, described the innovation. "A curious modification to the standard prospector's pan has emerged from the camps along the Yuba, featuring concentric ridges and a textured surface that purportedly captures the finest gold particles conventional equipment misses." Originating with a Virginia blacksmith working the smaller tributaries, the design challenges established wisdom, yet produces results sufficient to create substantial demand among experienced miners. The article continued with a tone of cautious endorsement, typical of period journalism regarding mining innovations. While this correspondent cannot verify the extravagant claims made by some advocates of the modified equipment, interviews with several reputable miners suggest meaningful improvements in yield, particularly in locations previously considered depleted. More significant than the equipment itself, however, is the systematic approach to prospecting its originator advocates, involving careful study of water conditions and sediment patterns before commencing work. This methodical procedure represents a departure from the hasty, often random techniques that have characterized much of the gold rush to date. Archaeological evidence confirms this spread. Excavations at multiple mining sites from the period have uncovered modified pans matching Whitaker's design, sometimes hundreds of miles from Whiskey Flats. A particularly well-preserved example recovered near Auburn in 1958 bears an etched maker's mark indicating manufacture in Sacramento in September 1852, suggesting how quickly the innovation was commercialized. By late 1852, professional mining supply catalogs included various versions of improved panning equipment featuring ridged or textured surfaces. An advertisement in the San Francisco Business Directory of 1853 promoted Whittaker pattern gold pans, the latest scientific improvement for the progressive miner, complete with instructional pamphlet on the principles of hydraulic concentration as discovered by the noted Virginia metallurgist. This commercial adoption, while spreading the practical technique widely, often simplified or misrepresented the underlying principles Whittaker had emphasized. The pamphlets and instruction sheets accompanying commercially produced pans, a few of which survive in museum collections, typically focused on the equipment itself rather than the observational methodology that Whittaker had considered equally important. This partial transmission of the innovation, the tool without the full technique, would become a pattern repeated with other mining technologies as the gold rush evolved. Thomas Whittaker himself remained at Whiskey Flats until April 1852, according to camp registries. During those months, his status evolved from ridiculed outsider to respected advisor, though contemporary accounts suggest he remained uncomfortable with the attention. Hammond's final journal entry regarding Whittaker noted, "He teaches willingly, but avoids celebration of his contributions. When pressed about his previous life or how he developed his theories, he becomes reticent." Some men carry more than their possessions with them to these remote places. This observation hints at the personal history that might have shaped Whittaker's distinctive approach. While direct evidence is limited, cross-referencing with Virginia records suggests a possible narrative. A Thomas Whittaker appears in Richmond business directories from 1838 to 1847 as a wheelwright and blacksmith with a modest but apparently stable business. City tax records indicate he owned a small property and paid regular assessments, suggesting a degree of financial security unusual for someone who would later abandon everything for the uncertain prospects of the gold fields. Court records from Richmond in 1846 mention a civil dispute involving a Thomas Whittaker, wheelwright, who was sued by a former business partner for allegedly withholding profits from an improved wagon wheel design. The suit was eventually dismissed, but witness testimony suggests that Whittaker had developed a reputation for unconventional technical approaches that initially faced skepticism, but eventually proved their worth. Whether this experience influenced his later willingness to endure ridicule while perfecting his mining techniques remains speculative but plausible. A more personal dimension emerged from parish records of St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, discovered during historical research in 1971. These records indicate that a Thomas Whittaker lost his wife and young son to typhoid fever in the winter of 1847-48, shortly before his departure for California. This tragedy may explain both his solitary journey west, unlike the groups or partnerships typical of gold seekers, and perhaps the reserved contemplative nature noted by Hammond and others at Whiskey Flats. In late April, Whittaker departed Whiskey Flats without announcement. The last official record of his presence in the gold fields is an entry in a Sacramento hotel register dated May 2, 1852. Some accounts suggest he returned east with modest but sufficient funds, while others indicate he continued to other mining regions. A Thomas Whittaker appears in Virginia business directories from 1854 onward, listed as a mechanical engineer and metallurgist, but confirmation of this being the same individual remains elusive. A tantalizing clue emerged during archival research in 1965, when historians discovered a patent application filed in Washington, D.C. in 1857 for an improved method for separating fine metals from aggregate materials by a Thomas Whittaker of Richmond, Virginia. The application included technical drawings showing a device with textured surfaces arranged to create controlled flow patterns, conceptually similar to the ridged pan used at Whiskey Flats, though more elaborate and mechanized. The patent was granted in 1858, but there is little evidence that the device was ever commercially manufactured on a significant scale. The legacy of Whitaker's innovation extended far beyond his brief tenure at Whiskey Flats. Mining technique manuals published throughout the 1850s and 1860s increasingly incorporated variations of his method. An 1859 Practical Guide to Western Mining, preserved in the Library of Congress, contains detailed illustrations of ridged panning surfaces and instructions for the observation-based prospecting approach, first demonstrated at Whiskey Flats. The paper's author, a mining engineer named Harrison Pratt, noted, "What is most remarkable about this case is that the fundamental principles of fluid dynamics being exploited were discovered through careful observation by individuals with no formal scientific training years before our professional literature began addressing these specific phenomena." By the late 1860s, as gold mining evolved from individual prospecting toward industrial operations, elements of Whitaker's approach were being incorporated into larger-scale equipment. An 1863 technical paper presented to the newly formed American Institute of Mining Engineers referenced the textured pan technique originating in the California foothills as an example of practical innovation preceding formal understanding. Hydraulic mining operations, which used pressurized water to dislodge gold-bearing sediments from hillsides, incorporated textured sluice box designs that created controlled turbulence patterns to capture fine gold particles, a direct descendant of the principles demonstrated with the ridged pan at Whiskey Flats. These industrial applications significantly amplified the economic impact of Whitaker's innovation. A technical assessment conducted by the California Bureau of Mines in 1875 estimated that modified sluice box designs based on the fine gold retention principles, first demonstrated with the Whitaker pan, had increased recovery rates in hydraulic mining operations by approximately 15% compared to earlier equipment. Given the scale of these operations, this improvement represented millions of dollars in additional gold extraction that would previously have been lost as waste. The most tangible evidence of Whitaker's impact emerged in 1887, when hydraulic mining operations near the original Whiskey Flat site uncovered a cache of mining equipment buried in a collapsed shelter. Among the items was a pan matching descriptions of Whitaker's design, along with a leather-bound notebook containing hand-drawn diagrams of water flow patterns and their relationship to gold deposits. These artifacts were exhibited at the California State Mining Museum until 1963, when they were removed for preservation and study. The discovery caused considerable excitement among mining historians and engineers. The Sacramento Bee of June 3, 1887, reported, "The excavation at Thompson's Flat has yielded what may be termed a Rosetta Stone of early mining technology, the actual implements and documentation of a method that, according to old-timers still working the region, revolutionized prospecting techniques during the difficult winter of '52. The pan itself, with its curious ridged surface, confirms accounts previously dismissed as exaggerated, while the accompanying notebooks reveal a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles developed through practical observation. Analysis of the pan by metallurgists at the University of California in 1959 confirmed that the ridged design significantly improved gold retention, particularly for particles smaller than 0.5 millilitrum, the fines that Whitaker had emphasized. Modern experiments conducted using replicas demonstrated that under certain conditions, the modified pan could capture up to 30% more fine gold than conventional smooth-surfaced pans. The notebook proved equally valuable to historians and engineers. The diagrams and notes it contained revealed not just a practical technique, but a sophisticated understanding of hydrological principles developed entirely through empirical observation. One page contained a remarkably accurate representation of what modern fluid dynamics would call a boundary layer separation zone, a concept not formally described in scientific literature until decades later. Dr. Robert Caldwell, professor of mining engineering at Stanford University, wrote in a 1964 analysis of the artifacts, What Whitaker accomplished through careful observation and methodical experimentation rivals the work of formally trained engineers of his era. His ability to identify complex fluid dynamics patterns without the mathematical framework we now use to describe them demonstrates how practical innovation often precedes theoretical understanding in engineering disciplines. Beyond the technical aspects, however, the Whiskey Flats incident represents a profound lesson about innovation and conventional wisdom on the frontier. In the harsh, unforgiving environment of the gold fields, conformity often seemed the safest path. Techniques that worked, however marginally, were clung to out of fear that experimentation meant starvation. Thomas Whitaker's willingness to risk ridicule and hardship to perfect a different approach, one based on systematic observation rather than tradition, ultimately created value not just for himself, but for an entire community that had initially rejected his methods. The historical record suggests that many of the miners who adopted Whitaker's techniques subsequently found success sufficient to establish themselves in California permanently. Land records from Yuba and Nevada counties show that at least 8 former Whiskey Flats prospectors, including Hammond, purchased agricultural land between 1853 and 1856, presumably with capital accumulated through their mining activities. Marriage and birth records indicate that several eventually brought families west or established new ones in California, transitioning from the transient existence of prospectors to becoming permanent settlers and community builders. While it would be an overstatement to attribute their success solely to Whitaker's influence, contemporary accounts suggest that his emphasis on methodical observation and adaptation to specific conditions served them well beyond the immediate context of gold panning. Hammond himself became a significant figure in the development of Nevada City, establishing its first school in 1854 with funds accumulated through his mining activities after adopting Whitaker's methods. School board minutes from 1857, preserved in county archives, record Hammond explicitly crediting his success to the lessons in methodical observation learned during that desperate winter of '52, which proved applicable not only to finding gold, but to every worthy endeavor since undertaken. Perhaps most tellingly, a letter from Hammond to his son, dated 1876, and preserved in family papers donated to the Yuba County Historical Society in 1965, reflects on the Whitaker incident from the perspective of 25 years' distance. I have often reflected that our greatest fortune at Whiskey Flats was not the gold we eventually found, but the lesson we learned from the quiet man with the rusty pan. In our haste and desperation, we had mistaken his careful observation for idleness, his innovation for ignorance, and very nearly lost a valuable teacher through our own prideful certainty. I have since approached every challenge in life with the humility born of that winter, knowing that wisdom often wears unfamiliar clothing and speaks in a voice easy to dismiss if one is not paying proper attention. This sentiment echoes through other accounts from Whiskey Flats survivors. A memoir published in 1879 by Alonzo Keegan, who later became a successful vineyard owner in Sonoma County, devoted an entire chapter to the lesson of the rusty pan, as he called it. Keegan wrote, "What separated Whitaker from the rest of us was not superior knowledge or skill, but his willingness to question what everyone else accepted without thought. While we rushed to apply techniques that had worked elsewhere, he patiently studied the specific conditions before us and developed methods suited precisely to them. This principle has guided my approach to agriculture ever since, and I credit it with whatever success I have achieved." Even Samuel Cross, who had led the assault on Whitaker, apparently internalized some aspect of the lesson. County records from Nevada City show that Cross established a moderately successful mining supply business in 1854, specializing in equipment modified for specific mining districts. An advertisement in the Nevada City Transcript from October 1855 promoted custom-designed prospecting equipment suited to local conditions, suggesting that Cross had thoroughly embraced the principle of adaptation to specific circumstances that he had once violently rejected. The rusty pan of Whiskey Flats thus stands as more than a footnote in mining technology. It represents a fundamental truth about frontier existence, that survival and prosperity often depended not merely on physical endurance or luck, but on the willingness to question established methods, to observe carefully, and to adapt thoughtfully to specific conditions rather than relying on general principles developed elsewhere. As gold mining evolved from individual prospecting to industrial operations in the latter half of the 19th century, the lessons of careful observation and site-specific adaptation that Whittaker championed became increasingly formalized in mining engineering practices. Hydraulic mining operations and later hard rock mining companies employed specialists whose role echoed Whittaker's methodical study of how natural features affected mineral distribution. Mining engineers of the 1870s and 1880s, equipped with more sophisticated tools and formal scientific training, would have recognized in Whittaker's approach the embryonic form of their own methodology. The essential insight that successful extraction required understanding the unique characteristics of each deposit rather than applying standardized techniques indiscriminately became a cornerstone of professional mining practice as the industry matured. The historical site of Whiskey Flats itself was submerged in 1966 with the construction of the new Exchequer Dam and the creation of Lake McClure. Archaeological salvage operations conducted before the flooding recovered additional artifacts confirming the accounts of Whittaker's influence, including modified pans and journal fragments from several miners describing their adoption of his techniques. These salvage operations, conducted under the direction of Dr. Elizabeth Harrington of the University of California, Berkeley, yielded a wealth of material that helped historians reconstruct the daily life of the camp in unprecedented detail. Particularly valuable were the remains of several cabin sites, where modified panning equipment was found alongside other artifacts, providing a material record of how quickly Whittaker's innovations had spread through the community. The Whiskey Flats excavation provides a rare opportunity to observe the rapid diffusion of technological innovation in a closed frontier community, Harrington wrote in her 1967 report on the findings. The modified pans found at multiple cabin sites, along with evidence of local attempts at manufacture, demonstrate how quickly a demonstrably superior technique could overcome initial resistance in an environment where efficiency directly impacted survival. In the broader context of Western frontier history, the Whiskey Flats incident illuminates the tension between individual innovation and community tradition that characterized much of the settlement period. The lone experimenter, often viewed with suspicion or derision, occasionally proved to be the salvation of communities facing changing conditions that rendered traditional approaches inadequate. The ready dismissal of Whittaker's methods based on their unfamiliar appearance, despite their demonstrated effectiveness, parallels numerous other instances where frontier communities initially rejected innovations that later proved essential to their survival. From agricultural techniques adapted to arid conditions to building methods suited to local materials, the Western frontier experience was ultimately shaped as much by those who questioned conventional wisdom as by those who maintained traditional practices. Professor Richard Slotkin, historian of the American West at Wesleyan University, placed the Whiskey Flats incident in this broader context in his 1985 analysis, Innovation and Resistance on the Mining Frontier. The goldfields created a paradoxical environment where desperate ambition fostered both reckless experimentation and rigid conformity. Individuals like Whittaker represented a crucial middle path, methodical innovation based on careful observation rather than either blind adherence to tradition or impulsive deviation from it. What remains most remarkable about the Whittaker case is not just that his innovation worked, but that it was eventually embraced by the very community that had ridiculed and attacked him. This speaks to a pragmatism that, while not always immediately apparent, existed beneath the surface of frontier society. When survival was at stake, results ultimately mattered more than conformity. This pragmatic adaptation was a defining characteristic of successful frontier communities. Those that rigidly maintained practices developed in dramatically different environments often failed to thrive or survive. Those that could integrate new approaches when circumstances demanded, especially techniques specifically adapted to local conditions, had substantially better outcomes. The Whiskey Flats experience exemplifies this pattern in microcosm. Initial resistance to innovation, followed by rapid adoption once its practical value was irrefutably demonstrated. The gold that Whitaker's method helped extract from the American River watershed contributed to the economic foundation of California's early development. But the real value of his contribution lay in demonstrating that careful observation and methodical experimentation could yield rewards even when conventional approaches failed. In this sense, the rusty pan that found gold where others could not serves as an apt metaphor for the innovative spirit that ultimately transformed the western frontier from a harsh wilderness into a settled society. California's transition from mining outpost to agricultural and eventually industrial powerhouse required precisely this willingness to adapt techniques to specific local conditions rather than attempting to transplant methods developed elsewhere. The lesson of Whiskey Flats, that success came from understanding the particular characteristics of a location rather than applying generalized approaches, proved applicable far beyond mining as settlers confronted the unique challenges of developing the western regions. Today, professional gold mining operations employ sophisticated technology to detect and extract microscopic gold particles using principles not entirely dissimilar from those Whitaker intuited through careful observation. The tradition of independent prospectors continues as well, with many modern hobbyists using pans with ridged or textured surfaces descended from designs like Whitaker's. Modern mineral processing equipment, though vastly more complex than a handheld pan, still exploits the same fundamental principles that Whitaker discovered through empirical observation, creating controlled flow patterns that separate particles based on their physical properties. Contemporary mining engineers, armed with advanced fluid dynamic simulations and material science, would recognize in Whitaker's ridged pan an early application of principles now thoroughly incorporated into their professional practice. In the historical record of American westward expansion, Thomas Whitaker remains a minor figure, one of countless individuals whose full stories remain fragmented and partially obscured. Yet the impact of his brief appearance at Whiskey Flats rippled outward in ways that affected both mining practices and, perhaps more significantly, attitudes toward innovation in frontier communities. The National Mining Hall of Fame in Leadville, Colorado, includes in its collection a replica of Whitaker's ridged pan, displayed alongside more famous mining innovations. The accompanying text acknowledges the anonymous prospectors who, through practical experimentation, developed techniques that would later be refined and formalized by professional engineers. Whitaker's story exemplifies this pattern of innovation emerging from practical problem-solving rather than formal research. The lesson of the rusty pan is ultimately about preparation versus presumption. Whitaker's success came not from luck, but from methodical study and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. The miners who initially mocked his approach had confused their familiar techniques with optimal ones, mistaking tradition for truth. When harsh winter conditions made their standard methods untenable, it was the careful preparation and systematic observation that they had dismissed as unnecessary which proved to be their salvation. In the annals of frontier history, filled with accounts of spectacular strikes and devastating failures, the quiet persistence of figures like Thomas Whitaker offers a different narrative, one in which success came not from gambling on fortune, but from patient observation, careful adaptation, and the courage to follow evidence rather than convention. It is a lesson as relevant to modern challenges as it was to those cold winter days at Whiskey Flats when a rusty pan found gold where no one else could.